We think about the ones who get left behind a lot around here. The ones the world writes off before they've had a chance to write their own story. This is one of those stories, and we think you'll want to hear it to the end. The notice arrived on the morning of November 3rd, 1891, slipped beneath the workshop door sometime before dawn, so that when Lena Aldcroft found it, the paper had already gone cold from the night air. She was 22 years old. She had been awake since before light, the way she always was, because the forge needed an hour to reach working temperature, and there was always work to do. The envelope sat on the packed earth floor beneath the gap in the door, white against the dark, and for a moment she simply looked at it. She had never received a letter in her life that carried good news. The return address was printed in the formal typeface of Colburn and Price Ironworks, out of Dunmore, Pennsylvania. The company that owned the building she stood in, the tools she worked with, and, as of that morning, the remainder of her life as she had known it. She picked it up. She opened it without ceremony. The language was legal and dense, full of terms like vacate the premises and cessation of informal tenancy, and as per the terms originally extended to the late Mr. Harlan Goss. The essential fact was simple enough. Harlan Goss was dead. He had been dead for 7 months. His informal arrangement with the company, the use of the workshop in exchange for a percentage of his commissions, had died with him. Lena had been allowed to continue working in the months since his passing on the understanding that she was settling his affairs. That understanding, the letter explained, had now expired. She had 14 days to vacate the property. The company offered her $25 for the quiet relinquishment of any tools or materials she might otherwise claim as her own. $25. For the bellows Harlan had rebuilt twice with his own hands. For the quench tank he'd lined with river clay. For the half-finished commission on the work table. A set of hand-wrought cabinet hinges for the Hartwell house. That she had been 3 days from completing. She set the letter on the anvil, which is where Harlan had always put things he needed to think about. Then she went back to work, because the fire was ready, and because she did not know what else to do. Harlan Goss had taken her on when she was 15, not out of charity. He was not a charitable man in any soft sense of the word. He was a blacksmith of the old school, lean and deliberate, with a way of looking at iron that Lena had only ever seen in people who truly loved their work. He had known her father, and when her father died of a fever, the summer she turned 15 and her mother's brother came to claim the house and made it plain. She was not part of what he intended to claim. Harlan had appeared at the door of her uncle's property on a Monday morning with a set of tools wrapped in canvas and a single question. The girl's got 2 good hands and a working head, doesn't she? Her uncle had been so surprised he'd said yes before he thought better of it. That had been the whole of her rescue. No ceremony, no proclamation. Just a man who saw a use for her that had nothing to do with pity. She had swept his floors and minded his fires for the first year the way all apprentices did. By the 2nd year, she was drawing wire and cutting stock. By the 4th, Harlan was letting her do finish work on the smaller commissions. By the time she was 19, people who came to the shop with orders sometimes assumed she was the smith and Harlan the assistant, which made him laugh in a way that was not unkind. He never gave her a formal title. He never raised her wages past what he thought was fair. But he taught her everything he knew, and he knew a very great deal. He died in April, a sudden thing, his heart, the doctor said, and not much else by way of explanation. He left no will, no property, no savings to speak of. He left her the use of the shop, informally, and his tools, informally, and a lifetime of knowledge pressed into her hands through 7 years of daily work. And he left her one other thing, a small-handled chisel, iron and worn smooth at the grip, that he had carried in his shirt pocket every single working day she had known him. He used it not for chiseling but for marking, scratching measurements into stock, setting out the lines of a design in metal before the hammer touched it. She had asked him once why he always used that particular one, and he had said, "Because it fits my hand and I know what it'll do." He had pressed it into her palm the last day he was on his feet, without explanation, and she had understood it for what it was. She kept it in her left apron pocket now, always. She put the letter in the cold end of the forge and went back to the cabinet hinges. Over the next 3 evenings, she sat at Harlan's workbench after the fire was banked, and she did what he had always done when a problem needed solving. She thought it through out loud, in writing the way he had taught her. Not feelings but facts, not what she wished but what was true. She was 22. She had 7 years of smithing experience, most of it in finish ironwork, hardware, fixtures, decorative commission pieces. She was skilled, genuinely skilled, not in a modest way, but in a precise and accurate way. She knew it because she had watched Harlan's face when he inspected her work in the last 2 years of his life, and his face never lied. What she did not have: a last name that opened doors in Dunmore, a husband, a father, a single letter of formal reference, because Harlan had not been a man who wrote letters. And because the ironworks company that now wanted her gone was the same company anyone in this trade would expect her to apply to. She made her list of options and crossed them out one by one. Apply to Colburn and Price directly. They would offer her work as a laborer, polishing and buffing finished goods, for a third of what she earned now. She would rather have the cold. Find a position in a household, as a cook or seamstress. She could do neither with any competence, and the thought of it was so foreign to who she was that she felt something close to revulsion. Move to Pittsburgh, possible, but she would arrive unknown, with $25, into a city that had no reason to notice her. The arithmetic was bleak. She had her skill, and she had one tool, and she had a name in this town that was attached to another person's reputation. But that last part, she looked at it again. Harlan's name meant something in Dunmore. It meant more than she had probably understood while he was alive. The cabinet hinges on her workbench were going to the Hartwell house, because Edmund Hartwell had been a customer of Harlan's for 12 years. The set of fireplace tools in the corner waiting for collection had been ordered by a woman named Gretchen Palliser, who had told Lena once that Harlan's work was the only ironwork worth having east of the Allegheny. Lena looked at the chisel on the bench beside her. Then she looked at the work in front of her. She would finish every open commission, every single one. She would finish them better than they needed to be finished. And when she delivered them, she would not apologize for herself, or explain her situation, or ask for anything. She would simply let the work speak in the voice that Harlan had spent 7 years teaching her to use, and then she would figure out the rest. She finished the Hartwell hinges on a Friday. She had been working since 4 in the morning, and the winter light was just coming through the high window, over the quench tank, when she set the last one down and looked at the set laid out on the cloth. They were good. They were very good. The leaves were even, and the knuckles were clean, and the pins moved with a smooth precision that would last, realistically, longer than the cabinet they were going to hang on. She wrapped them in the same oiled canvas Harlan had always used and walked them to the Hartwell house herself. Edmund Hartwell was a man in his 60s, silver-haired and deliberate, the kind of man who looked at things carefully before he spoke about them. He unwrapped the hinges at his front door and examined each one in the pale morning light, turning them over in his hands, testing the action of the pins. He said nothing for a long moment. "These are Harlan's work?" he asked finally. "They are my work," Lena said. "I completed them this morning." He looked at her over the hinges. Then he looked at the hinges again. "The finish on the knuckles," he said, "is better than his." She did not say anything to that, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like either false modesty or inappropriate pride. She simply waited. He invited her inside. He poured her coffee, which she accepted because she had not eaten since the previous afternoon and the walk in the cold had been long. He asked her what her situation was, and she told him plainly, without self-pity and without dramatics. The letter, the 14 days, the $25 offer. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, "I know the building they're putting you out of. I know the man at Colburn and Price who manages the property leases. His name is Victor Stream. He is not a sympathetic man, but he is a practical one." She waited. "There is a property, Edmund Hartwell, on the south end of Mill Pond Road. It belonged to a tinsmith named Corvin Dale, who died 3 years ago without heirs. The building has been sitting in estate limbo ever since. His creditors couldn't agree on the value, and the county hasn't moved to settle it. The forge is still there. Old, but the structure is sound." He paused. "I know the county clerk who is managing the estate. The asking price, if someone were to make a formal offer through proper channels, would likely be somewhere around $40. Maybe less if the offer came attached to a credible name." Lena was quiet for a moment. She had $25 from the company offer and $31 of her own, saved over 2 years in a tin beneath the floorboard of the workshop. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Edmund Hartwell set down his coffee cup. "Because Harlan Goss made things that worked," he said. "And so, apparently, do you. And because this town is going to need a blacksmith in 10 years, who isn't working for the ironworks company, and I would rather it be someone I trust than someone I don't." He wrote a letter that afternoon, not to the county clerk, to 6 people. The clerk, the minister of the First Presbyterian, a lawyer named Augustus Webb, the woman who ran the Dunmore Lending Library, the owner of the largest hardware supply in the county, and a doctor whose name Lena didn't recognize, but who Hartwell said had delivered half the children in town and knew everyone. The letter said, simply, that Harlan Goss's former apprentice was a smith of exceptional ability, that her work spoke for itself, and that he was putting his name behind her character without reservation. She did not ask him to do this. He did not ask her permission. He simply did it, in the quiet way of a man who had decided something and saw no reason to make a performance of the decision. She left the Hartwell house with the letter in her hand and stood for a moment on the front step in the cold air. She had $56. She had a letter. She had 7 years of a dead man's knowledge in her hands. It was, she thought, not nothing. The property on Mill Pond Road was worse than she had prepared herself for, and she had prepared herself for bad. The roof of the attached lean-to had partially collapsed under a winter's worth of accumulated snow and debris. The forge itself, a double hearth setup, larger than Harlan's, was intact but had gone cold for 3 years and was choked with rust at every joint and fitting. The bellows were seized. One of the anvil horns had been broken off, probably in transit or a fall, and the stump was rough and useless. The floor of the main room was packed dirt that had heaved and cracked with freeze and thaw until it was treacherous underfoot. She stood in the middle of it, in her coat, and looked around for a long time. She could see what it could be. That was the thing Harlan had taught her, she realized. Not just the work, but the way of seeing. The forge hearths were deep and well-placed, positioned to draw from the natural airflow through the south-facing opening. The stone walls were 2 feet thick and solid. The main structural beams overhead were hand-hewn oak, the kind that didn't rot even when neglected. Whoever Corvin Dale had been, he had built his workplace to last. She took the chisel from her apron pocket and used it to scratch a line in the packed dirt floor, outlining where she would start, the way Harlan had always done. You begin by marking what you mean to do, then you do it. The county clerk, a thin man named Percival Grout, who wore the same wool vest every time she saw him, accepted the $40 offer with the letter from Edmund Hartwell attached and processed the paperwork in 11 days. She paid from her savings and the company settlement combined, which left her with $16, a set of hand tools, a seized forge, and a property that was legally hers. $16, she wrote it down, the way Harlan had taught her. Liabilities, roof repair, bellows replacement, the broken anvil horn. No customers yet. No one knew she existed on Mill Pond Road. Winter was deepening by the day, and nobody came looking for new ironworkers in December. She began with the roof because the roof couldn't wait. She did not know carpentry in any formal sense, but she understood load and structure and materials in the way that anyone who worked with them daily had to understand them. She salvaged timber from the collapsed sections of the lean-to itself, cut it to length with a handsaw borrowed from the hardware supply on Edmund Hartwell's account, and rebuilt the frame, board by board, over 4 days in temperatures that turned her breath to fog and her fingers to wood inside her gloves. She covered it with salvaged tin sheeting, overlapping the seams the way she had seen tin work done. Sealed with a mixture of pine pitch and ash she had read about in one of the small technical pamphlets Harlan had kept on the workshop shelf. The bellows she rebuilt from scratch, because there was no other option. She had watched Harlan do it once, years ago, when the original had given out. The frame was white oak. The plates were double-thickness canvas, bought from the dry goods store. On credit she negotiated against the Hartwell letter. The leather valve she cut and shaped herself from a piece of harness leather she found in the collapsed debris, and it was the 3rd attempt before she got the taper right. But when she tested it with the forge banked low, the draw was strong and even, and she felt something she recognized from the best moments in the workshop. The quiet satisfaction of a thing done correctly. The anvil horn was the problem she returned to last. A broken horn cannot be welded back cleanly. She knew this. She had thought about it for 2 weeks. Then, late one evening, she pulled out the set of old order books Corvin Dale had left behind. She had found them in a box under a collapsed shelf and went through them page by page. On the 37th page, she found it. Corvin Dale had made a standing order every spring from a foundry in Clearfield called Mossway Iron for raw castings, ingots, blanks, and occasionally specialty shapes. The last entry was dated 1888. The foundry address was written in Dale's cramped hand at the top of the page along with a name, Mr. Thomas Hadley, foreman. She wrote a letter that night, not asking for credit or charity. She described the broken horn with precise measurements, described what she needed cast, and included a small sketch of the geometry with notes on the alloy she preferred. She signed it with her name and the Mill Pond Road address and waited. 3 weeks later, A wagon came up the road with a crate on it. Inside the crate was the casting she had specified, wrapped in oilcloth, and a note from Thomas Hadley that said, "Rarely get an order this precise from anyone not trained at a proper foundry. Work is enclosed, invoice attached. Terms net 60 days if you need them." The casting fit the stump so cleanly, she only needed 20 minutes of grinding to seat it. She drilled and pinned it, peened the pin flush, and when she struck it with a test blow, the ring was clean and true. She opened the forge for business on the 15th of January. Nobody came for the first week. This she had expected. She used the time to make inventory pieces, hardware she could sell directly, latches, hinges, hooks, bolts, the basic staples of a working town. She arranged them on a shelf she built along the south wall, where the light from the window would catch the finish. She was not decorating. She was displaying, in the way Harlan had always displayed the best pieces. Not hidden in a drawer but visible, because people needed to see what they were buying before they knew they wanted it. The first customer was a woman named Bertie Krause, who came in off the road on a Thursday afternoon because she had seen the smoke from the forge chimney and assumed the old place had reopened under new management. She needed a replacement latch for a root cellar door. Lena made it while she waited, which took 11 minutes. Bertie Krause watched the whole process in silence, then paid without haggling and went home. She came back 2 days later with her neighbor, a man named Roland Fitch, who had a gate hinge that had sheared at the weld after 15 years. Lena looked at the break, told him the original weld had been improperly dressed. Too much flux, not enough penetration, and that she could do it correctly this time for 30 cents. Roland Fitch watched her do it, and when she handed it back to him, he flexed it 3 times and said nothing, which she had learned by now was a form of high compliment from men of his type. Word moved the way it always moved in a small place, slowly, then all at once. By the end of February, she had a full order book, not a comfortable full. There were still days when she added coal to the forge and waited, and no one came, but a working full, the kind that kept a person occupied and earning. The Hartwell hinges had become something like a calling card. Edmund Hartwell had apparently mentioned her to 3 separate people who had mentioned her to 3 more, and several of those had brought their business to Mill Pond Road. She hired a boy named Clem Ott, 12 years old, son of a widow on the next road over, to work the bellows and sweep and learn. The same position she had held at 15, and she paid him the same wage Harlan had paid her, which was fair, and taught him the same things, which was the point. It was in March that the matter of Colburn and Price came back to her attention, though not in a way she had anticipated. A man arrived at the shop on a gray Tuesday morning, well dressed in the way of company men, with clean boots that had not seen much outdoor work and a ledger book under his arm. He introduced himself as Mr. Hale Stroud, procurement manager for Colburn and Price Ironworks. He said he had been directed to her shop by several of the company's residential clients, who had been bringing their fine metalwork commissions to her rather than to the company's own finishing department. He sat in the chair she kept for waiting customers. A plain thing, unpadded, and he said, without particular warmth, that the company was interested in a subcontracting arrangement. She would take on overflow finish commissions from the ironworks. The company would provide the rough stock. She would do the finish work. They would pay her 60% of the commission value. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "No." Hale Stroud looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has not been told no recently enough to have developed patience for it. "We are offering you access to the largest order volume in this county," he said. "You are offering me 60% of what my work is worth. Delivered on your timeline, under your specifications. With your name on the finished piece," she said. "I currently work at 100%, on my timeline, under my specifications, with my name on the finished piece. The arrangement you're describing would make me an employee without the security of employment. I've done that. I don't intend to do it again." There was a silence. 70%, he said. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Stroud," she said. "Clem, can you show Mr. Stroud out?" Clem Ott, who was 11 and a half and took his responsibilities seriously, stood up from the bellows with admirable gravity and gestured toward the door. She heard later through Bertie Krause, who heard it through someone else, that Victor Stream at Colburn and Price had said something to the effect that Harlan Goss's girl was more trouble than she was worth. She considered that for a moment when she heard it. Then she went back to the gate hinges she was working on, because there were 4 of them due by Friday, and the iron wasn't going to move itself. Spring came late that year, the mud lasting well into April. But when it finally dried, the Mill Pond Road shop had been open for 4 months, and the order book had not been empty in 6 weeks. She had repaid the net 60 terms to Thomas Hadley at Mossway Iron. She had fixed the lean-to-roof properly with new timber she could now afford. She had bought a second anvil, a small one, for detail work, from an estate sale in town, and it sat beside Harlan's old one. On a base she had poured herself from a concrete mix she'd read about in a pamphlet from the county agricultural library. She kept Harlan's chisel in her left apron pocket the way she always had. She still used it for marking, scratching the first line of each new piece before the hammer touched it. The grip had worn even smoother in her hand than it had in his, which seemed right. Tools were supposed to fit the person who used them. On the first warm evening in May, Edmund Hartwell came by the shop just before closing time. He brought a bottle of cider and 2 cups, which she accepted because she had been on her feet since 5 in the morning, and the cider was cold. He sat in the customer's chair and looked around at the shop, at the inventory shelf with its careful display, at the second anvil, at the order tickets, pinned neatly to a board on the wall, at Clem Ott stacking coal by the door with the unhurried efficiency of a boy who had been taught to do things right. Harlan would have found this funny, Edmund said. You running him out of a job. He wouldn't have found it funny at all, she said. He would have wanted to inspect the weld on that new anvil base. Would it have passed? Yes, she said, eventually. Edmund Hartwell smiled at that, the small, complicated smile of a man who had known Harlan Goss well enough to recognize the truth in it. He raised his cup. She raised hers. To impractical inheritances, he said. She thought about that for a moment, the chisel in her apron pocket. The way Harlan had always said that the most important thing you could pass to another person wasn't money or property, but the knowing of a thing. How to read iron, how to judge a weld, how to set the first line before the hammer fell. To the knowing of things, she said, and she meant it completely. She had not been rescued. She had not waited for rescue. She had taken what a dead man left inside her hands, and she had built something that was entirely unmistakably hers. The shop on Mill Pond Road had a sign above the door by Summer. She had made it herself, naturally. Iron letters, each one hand-forged, mounted on a timber frame. It read simply, Aldcroft Ironwork, 2 words, her name, her trade. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Before we let you go, we'd love to know, what's the most valuable thing someone has ever passed on to you? Not money, not property. The kind of thing that lives in your hands, or in your mind, the way Harlan's knowledge lived in Lena's. Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.